All right. Well, welcome. I guess this is kind of weird, but hey, this happens when we have massive pandemics in the spring, I guess. Nice thing is, for some of us teachers, we can wear slippers instead of shoes and nobody will even know. It was weird. Mr. Benosic was wearing jeans today. I don't know, whatever. So what we're going to talk about now is a unit that's going to lead into the idea of the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion is something that you don't hear very often throughout history, in history classes, which is weird because it's huge. It's a big deal. One of the biggest historical events that's ever happened in the world, but it gets overlooked by a lot of the history classes. And if you take world history and stuff, they might mention it in a paragraph or two in the textbook, and that's it. You'll see why that's such a big deal later as we get further into it. But what we want to talk about first is kind of the background that leads into the Taiping Rebellion. We just finished talking about the Opium War. We saw that the British absolutely defeated the Chinese. The Chinese got a really bad deal out of it. We have the unequal treaties, which essentially was European Western powers jumping in and carving up bits and pieces. We'll see a picture of that in a sec. Not a good time for China. The period of time that starts with the end of the Opium War and the unequal treaties is a period of time that the Chinese refer to as the century of humiliation. They were humiliated. They were embarrassed beyond belief by what had happened, and they did not have a good time for quite a while because of the Opium War, and not just that war, but the things that led up to that war. There were problems. They lost the war so badly for reasons, and we'll get into those reasons as well. So what we're going to look at first today, we'll get back to that picture of the Taiping Rebellion later, is the idea of unequal treaties left China at the mercy of these Western powers. We looked at this picture in class, the Europeans digging in. This is one we didn't look at. What you have is a yellow flag. Yellow is the official flag color of the Qing dynasty. If you looked at it closer, there's a dragon. You can Google it. There's a Qing dynasty flag. You'll see a dragon and a ball and stuff on there, and that was the emperor's symbol. So this is a Chinese flag being ripped up. You can even see CHINA. And then all these European and Russian-looking dudes tearing the thing apart. The Hakkas. That's going to be important later. So hang on to that in the back of your head. So the question we want to lead into, who were the foreigners in China around the time of the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion? We're getting into late 1840s into the 1850s at this point. Who was there? Who were the foreigners? On the one hand, you can say the Manchu. They were the ones that set up the Qing dynasty, right? They were the ones that conquered China, worked with some of the generals, and became the next dynasty. They're still in power. They're technically foreigners, right? And then there are a few Japanese people, merchants, mercenaries, a couple of those came in with the Opium Wars. Then also up north near Korea, there were some conflicts with the Japanese and the Chinese, and so there are Japanese in the country for that reason. There were Russians near the border who were in there. But for the most part, most of the people we're talking about right now are Westerners. British, French, German, Americans. These are the people that were in China. So question, who were the Western foreigners who were in China at the time? We're going to talk about three groups. The name of each group starts with an M. It's going to make it easy to remember, and it's important that you understand the kind of influence these people could have. The first group we look at, missionaries. I get this one. I mean, I was in China as a missionary. That's why I went, although it was 160 years later than most of these events. So it was different world, different purpose, different style, but I kind of get this part. Here's a picture. One missionary lady here. You can see her, older white lady. And the rest of these would be Chinese natives. Take a second and observe a couple of things. Most of them are sitting down, well, I guess half of them. Why would they be sitting? Well, yeah, to be in the photo and all that stuff. But really good chance these ladies had bound feet. Remember, we talked about that. So a lot of Chinese women could not stand on their feet for long periods of time because of the bound feet. Look at the difference in dress. See the wide sleeves, the shirts that go down way past the knees, and then they wear pants under the shirts. And then the small shoes with the lotus foot kind of idea. See the hair pretty much pulled up tight. These are not super fancy robes. These are not probably wealthy people, but they don't exactly look like poor peasants either, because there's color and there's embroidery on the clothing. You see the stripes down there. There's probably some silk in there, but probably a lot of cotton and wool. This is not scratchy linen fabric, but this is not super nice silk either. So somewhere in between, not the wealthy, not the poor. That's a lot of who these particular people were in this picture. Now look at the lady's dress. Look what she's wearing. Super high collar, ruffles on the sleeves. This is very much a Western dress of the 1850s period. Next, a group of men. So you see missionaries, missionary, missionary, same. So we got 1, 2, 3 local dudes. Note the difference in dress. They're wearing dress pants, probably kind of like a suit, with an overcoat, hats, leather shoes, typical Western attire for the time. Look at the collars. They've got the priest collar, right? Now look at the native guys, the Chinese guys. See what they're wearing. They've got the hat. This would have been a small round hat, covers the crown of the head, because the guys would have had the queue, right? The long ponytail going down the back. Also, long sleeves, long shirt, even longer than the ladies were, right? Definitely past the knees, almost to the ankles, and it's just what men wore. They looked at Westerners like, this is silly. Their clothing is also tight. They tuck it into their pants. That's just strange. And then Westerners would come look at them and be like, the men wear dresses with the pair of trousers underneath. That's odd and unusual. Weird stuff. So, different styles, different people. There's an idea. Another group. Now these would have been special occasions. This was the 1850s. Taking photographs, that was expensive. It was hard to arrange. There were only so many people that did it. After you take the picture, you had to take these films back to the studio, dump them with chemicals and stuff, and try to develop it, get it put onto paper. Tricky, expensive business. So there weren't a whole lot of photos like this that were taken. A couple things that you can notice from this photo is it's not always like we just saw in the previous picture. There were some missionaries that did adopt more of the Chinese style stuff. Like for example, this dude here in the middle, big heavy set beard. You don't see that genetically in a whole lot of Chinese people. This is a foreign missionary. But you see the big broad sleeves, you could stick both arms in there and do that thing. He's wearing Chinese clothing. So is this dude. That seems to be a Western style mustache. Picture's not very clear, just a little fuzzy, kind of grainy because it's old and blown up a bunch for the slideshow. But this is a totally different group. They adopted some Chinese style clothing probably to fit in a little bit. Now remember, missionaries were not super welcome in China at this time because of the little fight the emperor and the pope had. The idea that you can be Christian originally, according to Matteo Ricci, and you could still worship your ancestors, and that was okay. And then the Pope found out, he's like, no, you can't worship your ancestors. You worship God and nobody else. And then the emperor was saying, well, if they can't worship their ancestors, they can't be in China. And so there's a big falling out between the church and the Chinese government. Then this is a different group, though, because that would have been Catholics, right? So there's also Protestants. These are people that sprang up after the Reformation, Lutherans, and some of the groups that developed afterwards that had problems with the Catholic Church and started their own churches. So a lot of these guys are more the American Protestant tradition, evangelicals, Baptists, groups like that who came into China. So 3 groups of people, foreigners, Western foreigners who were in China. They all start with M. I guess we should do like that, right? Like an M. The first one, missionaries. Let's look at the next group. No. This is another picture of missionaries. Let's look at them, just real quick. What do you notice about the guys? This would be early 1900s, so we're getting after the period a bit. See some Chinese guys down here? Western style suits. Do you notice the hair? Remember the cue, remember the slogan? Keep your hair, lose your head. Lose your hair, keep your head. These guys were engaged in subversive behavior. If they're not wearing the queue, and if they're dressing like their missionary buddies who came in and are teaching them English and Western science and some of those ideas, they're kind of engaging in illegal acts. If not from meeting with missionaries, definitely from some of the behaviors they were picking up from these foreigners. That's not always a welcome thing in the scope of this Chinese history that we're going through. Okay, moving on. Mercenaries. We're going to look into some people more specifically, and I'll post an assignment in the Google Classroom for it. A mercenary, what does that word mean? Think about it. Soldier of fortune is another term that's often used for mercenaries. Mercenaries are people who go and they fight for money. And we're not talking somebody who's just in the army and that's his job and that's what he does for a living. We're talking about somebody who goes out and chooses a side, they get paid, and that's why they're there. Not because of any loyalty, not because of any citizenship, just because they fight for a living and it's what they do. In the American Revolution, we hired German mercenaries to help us fight against the British. And this was a time where mercenaries could be hired to go in and fight in other places like India or China. The East India Company could hire mercenaries to go in and help put down rebels, peasant rebellions, and that kind of stuff. So a couple of mercenaries that we're going to look at specifically, Frederick Townsend. Again, there's going to be Frederick Townsend Ward, sorry. There's going to be an assignment about him that you'll just have to look him up and tell me some details about him. This other guy is quite famous. Charles George Gordon, sometimes known as Shanghai was his nickname. You'll see more about him. But these are guys that left home, left whatever other reputable business they could have been involved in, and for money went out and decided to take on this kind of career. So what did a mercenary look like? What did they do? The art kind of speaks for itself in some ways. We'll zoom in just a little bit so you can see the artwork better. So a couple things to note. Again, photography, very expensive and hard to get. And you had to sit still sometimes, for like an hour in front of the camera so that it would develop the picture after the flash. And that's why you see people sitting and they look all tired and cranky. It's because they've been sitting on a hard chair for an hour waiting for a picture. So you didn't get a whole lot of battlefield pictures in the 1850s. Definitely not in the 1840s. What you would have is you'd have journalists who would either be present for events and then later they would sketch out what happened, or they would describe it to an artist and the artist would make an artist's rendition. When that happens, you're going to have a lot of bias into the picture because it's not a true just photo snap of events. It's going to be somebody's rendition, somebody's interpretation. So look at it. What do you have? Army full of heathen, peasant Chinamen, and a mercenary. Who looks like he's absolutely dominating the battlefield here? The one dude against this veritable army of guys with swords, pointy little barbaric looking hats, and shields. So even though there are potentially dozens, maybe 100 of them, he's kicking butts and taking name in his suit and tie, right? Casually using his pistol when he has, in fact, a rifle in his hand. This guy, he's not even firing at him. So this is meant to give you an impression of the all-powerful Western mercenary, the force to be dealt with, right? Here's another shot. On horseback, look for the cues. See the big British fluffy mustaches going into sideburns. See the hats, the helmets that have the point on top, muskets in hand, noble stallions riding into the battlefield. Right, you see it all around. You see it up here too. This guy's slightly different hat, almost cowboy hat style, maybe a little bit more Civil War type style, flying off into battle. And what does the whole movement of the picture impress upon you? Victory, right? They're pushing this way. What do you see in any of these pictures? You ever see a body on the ground of a mercenary or Western guy? Usually not. Usually it's a native, some Chinese guy. You can tell from the pointy hats and stuff, and the fallen, usually there's a broken sword next to them. I'm sure they didn't go around actually breaking guys' swords in the battlefield and leaving them there, right? They would shoot and move on. But that's what you see in the pictures. And then what do you see here off in the distance? Bunch of little pointy hats, and that's the Chinese fleeing before the mercenaries. This is meant to, when these things were sent home and coupled together in a newspaper with like some missionary's account of these barbarians were going to overrun our village and the British and their mercenary army came in and saved us, these would go along with those. And it gave these young men in the Western countries this romantic notion of going and being a mercenary and having an adventure and seeing China, experiencing the world, and sure you had to kill a lot of people to do it, but whatever. Here we go, more Westerners attacking Chinese cities, the great huge walls, right? can notice the Asian architecture with the roof curling up. Again, what do you see as far as bodies? Chinese. You see the Q even written on their, drawn onto their heads. Very few of them. Lots of these guys. Swords versus muskets. Very cool and composed, very frantic and freaking out. That's kind of the idea of the mercenary artwork. And our third M, our third group. So 3, we've got missionaries, we've got mercenaries, and now we've got merchants. Merchants would be people who buy and sell things. We're not going to talk a whole lot more about them right now because we just talked about the Opium War for like forever. And we talked about smugglers and people bringing goods and buying and selling and trade deficits and trade surpluses, all that stuff. So that's covered with merchants, right? That's who we're talking about. When we get back from all this craziness and we have a test on these units, do expect to have some questions on what kind of Western foreigners were in China, who were they? Just remember the 3 M's and that'll help you out a lot. Missionaries, mercenaries, merchants.